There are buildings in the high desert of the American Southwest that have stood empty for 700 years. Cliff dwellings 5 stories tall, carved into sandstone, masonry so precise that modern builders still struggle to match it. And then, around the year 1300, the people who built them were gone. The textbooks settled on a single word for what happened here: vanished. A sophisticated farming civilization, one of the most advanced anywhere north of Mexico, that rose, flourished for centuries, and then simply disappeared. For 150 years, that was the story, a mystery with no ending. Then scientists pulled ancient DNA from the bones those people left behind, and what it exposed was stranger than disappearance. They never actually vanished at all. The evidence has been standing in plain sight the entire time, because the DNA did not just prove they survived, it exposed exactly where they went. To understand why their disappearance landed so hard, you first have to understand what was lost. And that means going back to a world that for nearly 3 centuries was the most sophisticated thing happening anywhere north of Mexico. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by almost nothing. No river of any consequence, no fertile valley. Looking at it today, no obvious reason anyone would build anything there at all. And yet, between roughly 850 and 1150 of the Common Era, it became the political, religious, and architectural center of a civilization that stretched across 90,000 square miles, an area larger than Ireland. They built great houses, more than 150 of them. Massive stone structures rising up to 5 stories, some containing over 600 rooms, constructed with a standard of masonry that modern builders still find difficult to replicate. The walls were engineered with rubble cores faced in precisely cut sandstone. The rooms were aligned to track the sun and the moon across cycles that ran for decades, and they connected it all with a network of roads, some of them 30 feet wide, running in dead straight lines across the canyon country for hundreds of miles. These roads did not go around obstacles. They climbed cliffs rather than turn. They were built to say something about the people who made them, not simply to move goods from one place to another. This was not a scattering of villages. This was something organized, something with a center of gravity, something with a plan. And Chaco was not alone. To the north, in what is now southwestern Colorado, another hub was rising at Mesa Verde. The cliff dwellings tucked beneath sandstone overhangs, room upon room stacked into the rock face, sheltered from the sun and the snow. At its height, in the middle of the 1200s, the Mesa Verde region may have held as many as 30,000 people. That figure comes from the archaeologist Scott Ortman and the Village Ecodynamics Project, a decades-long effort to reconstruct exactly how many people lived in this landscape and when. 30,000. A population dense enough to sustain cities, ceremonies, and a culture that had deep roots reaching back centuries. By every measurable standard, this world was extraordinary. The planning, the engineering, the astronomical precision, the sheer scale of coordinated labor required to build and maintain it. And then, around the year 1300, it ended. Not gradually, not over many slow centuries. Within a few generations, the great houses were abandoned. The roads fell silent, the cliff dwellings emptied out. The people who had built and maintained one of the most ambitious construction efforts in the history of North America walked away and left it all standing. Perfect masonry, 5-story walls, ceremonial chambers full of ritual objects, empty. For a long time, this was treated as one of the great mysteries of American archaeology. A civilization rose, a civilization vanished. Here are the ruins they left behind. That was the story. It was the story in museums, in documentaries, in textbooks handed to generations of school children, except almost none of it turned out to be true. Here's the problem with that story. Nearly every part of it was written before anyone could read the bones. The textbook version of these people came together in the absence of the single most important kind of evidence. Before ancient DNA analysis existed, before forensic methods could reconstruct who someone had been from the skeleton alone, before anyone had sequenced genetic material from the remains buried beneath those great houses and compared it to the people living across the Southwest today. The narrative of peaceful farmers who mysteriously dispersed was assembled from pottery styles, architectural floor plans, and a great deal of careful guesswork. Researchers built elaborate theories on the shape of a grinding stone or the design of a ceremonial vessel. They were doing the best they could with the tools they had, but the actual biological records sat in museum drawers, largely unread. Even the name carried the same problem. For most of the last century, these people were called the Anasazi. The word is not their own. It comes from the Navajo language, and it is usually translated as something close to ancient enemies, a term many Pueblo people today consider offensive, which is why most archaeologists have moved away from it, preferring ancestral Puebloans. The Hopi have their own word, Hisatsinom, meaning the ancient ones, a people whose true name had been replaced by a label given to them by outsiders. And that detail is not a small one, because it points to something larger about how this whole story was told. There were people who knew the answer the entire time. The descendants of the builders, the Pueblo communities still living across New Mexico and Arizona, had been saying for centuries exactly where their ancestors came from. Their oral histories traced their origins directly back to places like Chaco Canyon. These were not vague legends. They were detailed accounts of migration, of belonging, of specific places left behind, passed down with care across generations, carried in songs and ceremonies and the structure of the languages themselves. To the communities who held them, these traditions were not metaphor. They were record. And the academic world, for most of the 20th century, refused to treat them as evidence. I want to be careful here because this is the part that deserves more than a clean summary. The dismissal was not always simple arrogance. Oral history is genuinely difficult to date. It does not come with timestamps, and a single account can compress thousands of years into a few sentences. Scientists are trained to want material proof, the kind you can measure and replicate. So the stories were set aside, filed under myth, treated as something charming rather than something true. The result, however, was the same. The people best positioned to explain where the ancestral Puebloans had gone were the people no one was listening to. So a strange situation took hold. A civilization was declared lost. Its descendants were standing right there, farming the same region, performing the same ceremonies, telling anyone who asked exactly what had happened. And the official version of events, the one in the museums and the documentaries, was built almost entirely without them. The question was never really where these people went. The question was why anyone ever believed they had gone at all. Still, something did force these people out of their homes. Whatever the descendants knew about where they went, the land itself records what drove them to leave. And that record is one of the most precisely documented transitions in all of North American archaeology. The first signal comes from the trees. There is a method called dendrochronology, the analysis of tree rings, and in the dry Southwest, it is extraordinarily powerful. Each ring marks a year. A wide ring means a wet season, a narrow ring means a dry one. Lay enough timbers end to end, overlapping ancient wood with younger wood, and you can reconstruct the rainfall of the Four Corners region year by year for more than 1,000 years. And what those rings show is stark. Beginning in 1276, the Southwest entered a prolonged dry spell that lasted until the very end of the century. Researchers call it the Great Drought. Winters grew colder, summers grew drier, the growing season shortened, and the maize agriculture that had fed this entire civilization, crops grown at altitudes and in soils that should never have supported them, began to fail season after season. That is the clean version of the story. A drought arrives, the crops die, the people leave. And for a long time, that was the explanation that settled into the textbooks. But here is where it gets more complicated, and I think the complication matters. These people had survived droughts before. Dry spells, just as severe, some of them worse, had come and gone across the centuries, and the civilization had endured them. A drought alone does not fully explain why this time the response was not to wait it out, but to abandon the homeland entirely and never return. And the archaeology tells us something else too. The depopulation had already begun roughly 2 decades before the Great Drought even started. The exodus was underway before the worst of the dry years arrived. The archaeologist Donna Glowacki, who has studied the social history of the Mesa Verde collapse in detail, has shown that the unraveling started earlier than the climate record alone would predict. So something more than weather was at work. And the bones from this period show what that something was. The final decades carry the marks of violence. At a site called Castle Rock, Pueblo, in southwestern Colorado, archaeologists found the remains of dozens of people who appear to have been killed in a single attack around 1285, their skeletons bearing the fractures of a community that met a brutal end. Across the region, villages that had once stood open began building defensive walls, retreating into more easily protected positions. The picture that emerges is not a peaceful people simply walking away from dry fields. It is a society under severe strain, fracturing from the inside as the resources that had held it together ran out. Climate failure, depleted soils and forests, social breakdown and conflict. 3 pressures, compounding one another until staying was no longer possible. But notice what none of this answers. Drought explains the leaving. Violence explains the leaving. They tell us why a homeland was abandoned. They do not tell us where tens of thousands of people went when they walked out of it. And that question, the one that actually matters, was about to be answered from a direction nobody expected. The answer would come from DNA. And ancient DNA is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have been in the ground for hundreds or thousands of years, sequence it against the genomes of people living today, and build a biological portrait of who those ancient individuals were and how they connect to the present. It is, in every meaningful sense, a time machine made of bone. The first major attempt to use it here came in 2017 at Pueblo Bonito, the grandest great house in Chaco Canyon. A team led by the archaeologist Douglas Kennett sequenced the remains buried in one of its most elite chambers and found something the textbooks had insisted was impossible. The individuals in that room were related closely through the female line across 9 generations and more than 3 centuries. This was not a society of equal citizens with no rulers. This was a hereditary dynasty, a single maternal lineage that had held power in Chaco for almost the entire span of its rise. The people had structure. They had a traceable line. But that study carried a problem of its own. It was done without consulting the Pueblo communities who descend from those very people. The bones were sequenced, the paper was published, and the living descendants were not part of the conversation. That omission would matter enormously, and we will come back to it. For now, hold on to the contrast. Because the next breakthrough pointed for the first time at a destination, and it came from an unexpected source: turkeys. The ancestral Puebloans kept domesticated turkeys, raised them, bred them, buried them, and the archaeologist Scott Ortman realized those birds carried a genetic fingerprint that could be tracked the same way human DNA could. His team sequenced ancient turkey remains and found a strong genetic match between the birds of the Mesa Verde region and the turkeys that turned up afterward in the northern Rio Grande, in the heart of New Mexico. A population signature moving south. People do not abandon their domesticated animals. When the birds moved, the people moved with them. And the turkeys were only one line of evidence. The Village Ecodynamics Project had already calculated something striking. The number of people who disappeared from the Mesa Verde region during the 1200s was roughly the same as the number who appeared in the Tewa Basin of northern New Mexico shortly afterward. The math lined up. Ortman went further still, studying the Tewa language itself, and concluded that its roots reached back not to the Rio Grande, where it is spoken today, but to southwestern Colorado, to Mesa Verde. The language had migrated along with the people who carried it, so the trail had a direction now, and it had named destinations. The northern Rio Grande, Zuni, Acoma, the Hopi Mesas. Tens of thousands of people had not walked into the desert and vanished. They had walked into communities that still exist today. But notice the limits of what we had. A turkey is not a person. A population count is a strong inference, not a fingerprint. The language is suggestive, not conclusive. Every line of evidence pointed the same way, toward living Pueblo people. What no one had yet was the one thing that could close the case. Human DNA matched directly ancient to living. That proof arrived in 2025, and it came from one of the smallest communities in the entire Southwest. The Picuris Pueblo is a sovereign nation in northern New Mexico, a tribe of only around 300 people today. They were once among the largest pueblos. Now they are the smallest. They live in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, roughly 170 miles east of Chaco Canyon, and for generations their oral history had placed their origins there at Chaco, among the people who built the great houses. For generations that account was set aside. As fights over oil and gas drilling near Chaco intensified, the Picuris found themselves overlooked, excluded from decisions about land their ancestors had built. So their leaders made a choice. They would test their own story with science, on their own terms. What followed was published in the journal Nature on the 30th of April, 2025, and it was unlike anything before it. The research was led and co-authored by the tribe itself, the first time a federally recognized native nation in the United States had directed a genomic study of its own ancestry. The scientists worked under the tribe's authority. The geneticist Eska Willerslev brought the laboratory expertise. The archaeologist Michael Adler, the researcher Tomás Pinotti, and the late Richard Mermejo, a former governor of the Picuris, who helped guide the work before his death, brought the rest. This was not science done to a community, it was science done by one. The team sequenced the genomes of 16 ancient individuals buried at Picuris, people who had lived between roughly 1300 and 1500 of the Common Era. Then they sequenced 13 living members of the tribe, and they compared all of it against an enormous reference set, around 300 populations from across the Americas and more than 5,500 individuals worldwide. The result was not ambiguous. No sampled population on Earth, ancient or living, was more closely related to the people of Chaco Canyon than the Picuris, not one. The match ran straight from the bones in the great houses to the people farming in the mountains today, including very rare genetic markers shared between them and almost no one else. The maternal lines held. The continuity held. A people the textbooks had called vanished turned out to have a direct, unbroken biological connection to a tribe that had never left the map at all. They had been there the entire time, 300 of them, telling anyone who would listen exactly who they were. For the people who had carried that story for centuries, the moment was not a discovery. It was a confirmation. The lieutenant governor of the Picuris, Craig Quancello, described what it meant to see their oral history finally validated on paper. They had always known who they were. Now it ran not only through their land and through their veins, but as he put it, through science as well. Think about what that inverts. For 150 years, the experts told the descendants their ancestors had disappeared. And in the end, it was the descendants who were right, and the experts who had simply not been listening. The DNA did not find a lost people. It caught up to a people who had never once considered themselves lost. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this, because the Picuris themselves were careful about exactly that, and it would be a disservice to overstate what their study proved. The Picuris do not claim to be the only descendants of Chaco. They have been clear about this. Their findings confirm one thread of the story, not the whole of it. Nearly 24 Pueblo tribes trace their connections to Chaco Canyon, and many Navajo clans carry their own histories tied to the region as well. What the genetics established is that the Picuris are linked to the people of the Great Houses with a closeness no other sampled group could match. It does not establish that anyone else is not. This was never a contest over who the real descendants are. It was one community confirming its own piece of a much larger, interwoven past. And there are genuine limits to the data. The sampling across the Southwest remains thin. No other Pueblo communities were included in the comparison, which means the picture is built from a narrow slice of a vast region. The researchers said so plainly. Many tribes declined to participate in genetic studies at all, and they have sound reasons rooted in history for that caution. So the absence of other Pueblos from the analysis tells us nothing about their ancestry. It only tells us who was willing to be tested and who was not. But here is what makes this study different from the one that came before it, and it returns us to that 2017 contrast. The Picuris research was built from the start as a model of tribal sovereignty over data. The tribe held the authority to halt the work at any stage. They controlled whether the results were ever published at all. The bones, the genomes, the conclusions, none of it left their hands. Where the earlier Chaco study had sequenced ancestral remains without consulting the descendants, this one inverted the entire arrangement. The community was not the subject of the research, it was the author of it, and that distinction reaches past the science. Because the deeper point is not that DNA finally proved the Pueblo oral traditions correct. It is that those traditions never needed a laboratory to be true. They had been accurate accounts of real events for centuries before anyone thought to test them. The genetics did not grant the story's legitimacy. The genetics simply arrived, late, at a place the stories had already mapped. To the descendants, this was never a question. We have always been here, they said, and the science, in the end, agreed. So we are left with a strange inversion of the original mystery. The disappearance was never real. There was no vanished civilization, no people who walked into the desert and dissolved. There was a homeland that became impossible to farm, a migration south and east into more forgiving country, and an unbroken line of communities that survived all of it and are still here. The vanishing was not something that happened to these people. It was something that was done to them, in the telling, by outsiders who looked at empty buildings and decided the story required an ending. The people themselves had never gone anywhere. They had only stopped being seen. The empty great houses are still there. The silence is real. Stand in Chaco Canyon today and you will see exactly what the first archaeologists saw. Perfect masonry, 5-story walls, ceremonial chambers swept by wind and sun. But the people who built them did not walk into nothing. They walked south and east, down the rivers to the mesas and valleys where farming was still possible, and they carried their masonry, their astronomy, their ceremonies, and their stories with them. Their descendants farm those valleys now. They perform those same ceremonies, and they carry, in their own bodies, the biological record of the ones who raised the great houses. The DNA did not rediscover a lost people. It confirmed what was never actually lost, except by the people who needed the story to end. The real mystery was never where they went. It is how long it took the rest of us to notice they were still here.